Today I'm putting together a little mini lecture on Baldwin and Sonny's Blues. I did find this clip from James Baldwin from a few years back, and as I will discuss later, he was very active in the civil rights movement in this country. And here he's asking the question about progress and how much time do we really need to change things. And so it's really short, but it's kind of interesting. You get to kind of hear his voice.
What is it you want me to reconcile myself to? I was born here almost 60 years ago. I'm not going to live another 60 years. You always told me it takes time. It's taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brothers and my sisters' time, my nieces and my nephews' time. How much time do you want for your progress?
How much time do you want for your progress? I think that's a pretty interesting question. So we're going to actually go to the lecture now, and there is a link to this here. So one thing, you guys did a really great job on the Sonny's Blues discussion board. Your examples and commentary about light and dark, very strong, and your discussions of grace. Some of you even connected his use of grace to the other stories we've recently read that kind of deal with the issue of grace. So good job on that. Some of you, if you wanted for your final research paper to do Sonny's Blues, have a pretty good start on it, actually. So Baldwin's a very complex and interesting man. As a young man, he was on his way to becoming a preacher. He was preaching at a very young age, going up to the pulpit and giving sermons. But he also at an early age realized he was homosexual, and during those days his sexuality and religion weren't a great match. So he left the church and pursued his writing career. Baldwin came of age in what is commonly referred to as the Jim Crow era, time that African Americans suffered a large amount of social and economic discrimination. And this social climate, coupled with being black, openly homosexual male, made for an oppressive environment that didn't exactly foster or value his talents. So like many other creative and talented African-American artists, they left the United States to live in Europe. I think Baldwin went to Paris. And in Europe, these Americans weren't burdened with the discrimination typically displayed by white America based on their race or sexual orientation. They were actually allowed to thrive there without that sort of tension that was always with them here in this country. So these expatriates were more able to pursue their very art forms in peace. Apparently Europeans weren't quite as hung up on race and sexuality as we were. So, and then during the civil rights movement, Baldwin felt compelled to return to the US to take part in the movement. And he was a very prominent voice in the civil rights movement and very, very vocal. So just a few little bit of background. Okay, so just kind of briefly, if I wanted to, I could spend 2 days just focusing on how Baldwin uses light and dark in this story, but I think you guys got pretty much the idea. But on the other hand, I could spend as much time focusing on his use of religion in the story. And I could also spend a whole lot of time talking about jazz and music, but we don't really have time for that. It's something that you could explore further if you want. That's why for our purpose, we just focused on dark and light. But you can certainly explore these other ones if you choose, especially if you choose this story for the final research topic. So I'm going to kind of go through this story, and I'll just kind of set it up in terms of some of the elements of fiction. I'm not going to cover them all, but the most prominent ones. So protagonist, really this is one where students really get kind of confused. Actually, the protagonist is the narrator. Keep in mind, this story is told in first person, okay? And it's told by the brother, not by Sonny. And you'll also notice he doesn't have a name, okay? But he's the one who changes. Early on in the story, we learn Sonny only has one passion, which is music or jazz. And throughout the story, Sonny never really deviates from that passion. He does finally become a musician. On the other hand, the brother has a dramatic change. He finally accepts Sonny for who he is. Antagonist. Oh, this one can be kind of murky, and we'll talk about it a little bit. And I think one of the things you might have found out, there's a certain amount of ambiguity with a lot of these different elements of fiction. And again, I'm not so concerned that I agree with you. It's that you can support your idea. Okay. So some people say that Sonny's the antagonist. He does appear to be the force that the brother is struggling against. You could also make the case that the setting is the antagonist. It's the environment, Harlem, dark, dangerous, awful. That's the cause of the brother's concerns. It's the racial climate of those times. Another one would be the brother's guilt. He feels he's failed in making sure Sonny stays out of trouble. Also, the life of a musician is one where drugs and alcohol are kind of part of the scene. Furthermore, how could Sonny have financial security in this profession at this time? Now, I want to talk about a quote, so I had to take a picture of it. I couldn't find it anywhere electronically that I can copy and paste it. Yeah, but it's one of the quotes that I think is really significant in figuring out what the brother's big problem is. And the brother thinks that he has to be totally responsible for Sonny and keep him out of trouble. But right after, this passage comes from right after when the mother's telling the brother about the car wreck that his uncle was killed in and his dad was there, which is, you know, a pretty powerful scene in and of itself. So they're talking about Sonny, okay? Or they're going to talk about Sonny here in a minute. So, oh, honey, she said, there's a lot that you don't know, but you're going to find it out. She stood up from the window and came over to me. You got to hold on to your brother, she said, and don't let him fall. No matter what it looks like is happening to him, and no matter how evil you gets with him. You're going to be evil with him many a time, but don't you forget what I told you, you hear? I won't forget, I said. Don't you worry. I won't forget. I won't let nothing happen to Sonny. My mother smiled as though she were amused at something she saw in my face. Then, you may not be able to stop nothing from happening, but you got to let him know you're there. Okay. So to me, this is kind of an important idea. And this kind of gets to, you know, why the brother is, you know, even, you know, reacting so strongly to this. And actually he fails because when the brother goes to prison, when Sonny goes to prison, the brother basically cuts him off. And the mother said, you can't stop things from happening. I just want you to let him know you're there, which the brother kind of failed at. So I think maybe one of the problems is kind of guilt for the brother. Yeah, kind of up here is that he failed. Okay. But he didn't really fail because the mother, that wasn't her issue. She figured Sonny would do something crazy. She just wanted the brother to be there for him and help him when he needs help. So that kind of explains the idea of guilt. Okay. So this kind of talks about that in this bullet point. Conflict. Okay. So both internal and external conflicts in the story. Internally, the brother's in conflict with the idea that somehow he's failed Sonny. So you can kind of see how this kind of overlaps. You can see how this is related to antagonist. One might also say that the internal conflict is how race in the U.S. only makes things worse for Sonny and the brother. Externally, you could view the setting. So this is another element of fiction, the setting, contributing to the overall conflict that the brothers share. The most prominent conflict is between the brothers. The narrator wants one thing while Sonny desires something totally different. Oh, I spelled Kate Chopin's name wrong. When I think about the conflict of the story, I think about something Kate Chopin wrote in Story of an Hour. There'd be no powerful will bending hers in a blind persistence with which men and women, or a brother, I added that, believe that they have a right to impose a private will on a fellow creature. And I would say this is kind of what the brother's trying to do to Sonny. And Kate Chopin would say that's probably a bad idea. The setting, Harlem, 1957, the year the story was written. Baldwin is always referring to dark when looking outside the train window, looking out a car window, or considering the outside while nestled in the security of a childhood home. Always dark. Harlem itself, the outside, is always viewed as dark. Now, excuse me. There's some symbolism we can look at. And the symbolism is actually very conventional, dark and light. And here's just kind of a list of how we think about these two. Dark is evil, good is Light is good and pure, dark, violence, safety, deception, truth, poverty, wealth, addiction, health, lack of opportunity, failure, success. And these really both could be the short list, but you kind of get the idea. Now, of course, we can't forget the narrator's daughter, Grace. I think that's very symbolic. It's her death that's the catalyst for reconciling the brothers. They've achieved a kind of grace as they work through the process that led to the brothers' acceptance of Sonny for who he is. Now, I think irony is also tied to this idea of dark and light, especially if we think about dark and light in terms of deception and truth, or lies and truth, particularly truth. Okay, so even though we want to associate truth with light or good, which I think we naturally do, the reality is sometimes the truth is very dark. And in this story, whenever they talk about dark, they seem to be actually talking about the truth, the reality of the situation, the reality of their lives, the reality of their potential, the reality of their future, the reality of their opportunities. I could go on and on. So then I think about what O'Connor had to say about truth. The truth doesn't change according to our ability to just stomach it. I think it applies here. So, theme. I think the theme in this is actually very, very, very simple. Okay, well, there could be a couple ways to look at it, but I think somehow it's got to be related to the idea of acceptance. Okay, and I think that the Chopin quote about imposing one's will on another kind of plays into this. You know, it's really not something we should do, and it's not helpful. Okay, so it could be acceptance. Keep in mind, a lot of people say, oh, this story's about drug addiction. It's not about drug addiction. Is there drug addiction in it? Absolutely. But it's not, that's not the focus. That's just one of the things that happens. Excuse me. Man, my throat's drying up here. I believe you know, I've covered some of the more relevant elements, but you can explore others on your own. So the last thing I want to talk about is just some key passages. And most of you guys got these in your discussion boards, so I'm just going to be quick. This one, well, really, you know, I didn't put this one in, but, you know, the first paragraph, he talks about the light swinging in the train, and then he looks outside into the darkness. Okay, so, and this is kind of in the first couple pages. He's talking about the boys in the neighborhood, and he talks about their heads bumped abruptly against the low ceiling of their actual possibilities. They were filled with rage. All they really knew were two darknesses, the one of their lives that were now closing in on them, in the darkness of the movies, which had blinded them to that other darkness. So what he's talking about here is, imagine yourself waking up one morning and understanding that because of the color of my sin, my opportunity, this color of my sin, the color of my skin, my opportunities are very limited, which can be a very, very awful truth. And in this case, probably was a very awful truth. And then he talks about the two darknesses. Well, the darkness of their lives. And then he talks about the darkness of the movies. And when he's talking about this darkness of the movies, why do we go to the movies? Well, we go to escape. It's escapism. It's entertainment. Okay, so going to the movies, it kind of relieved or blinded them that to the other darkness, the darkness of their lives. And then it talks about they were more together and more alone. But there's also this idea of rage, which I think is a real important idea. So this next passage is actually, I should have probably posted the paragraph that comes before this, but you could go back and read it because I think the two go together. This is after the first paragraph where he's kind of talking about the kids laying around the house and stuff like that. But I would say that these two paragraphs, particularly this one, are two of the most powerful, well-written, beautiful paragraphs I've ever read. If you read the paragraph before this one and then this one together, it's almost like a poem. I mean, that's how well written it is. It just has this rhythm, this meter, this flow, this kind of repetition in a way. So, man, In a moment, someone will get up and turn on the light. Then the old folks will remember the children and they won't talk anymore that day. When the light fills the room, the child is filled with darkness. And I want to talk about this for a minute. This is really kind of conflicting ideas, again, with that darkness. So when the light comes on, you shouldn't be filled with darkness, of course, but when the light or the truth fills the room, the truth is pretty dark. He knows that every time this happens, he's moved a little closer to that darkness outside. The darkness outside is what the old folks have been talking about. It's what they've come from. It's what they endure. The child knows that they won't talk anymore because if he knows too much about what's happened to them, he'll know too much too soon about what's going to happen to him. And that goes back to even that other paragraph. There's this theme of this, the reality, the truth, the darkness of their lives. And he just keeps kind of coming back at this and coming back at this. This one is one a lot of people, there's a whole bunch from the end of this story, and I want to talk about this because that part of the story where the brother is in the club waiting for Sonny to play is, if you went back and you just kind of really just read it and kind of just listened to the language and stuff, it's like on the stage, all these musicians are there, and they're kind of, there's a kind of a light, you know, a spotlight, and these musicians are kind of moving in and out of the spotlight, never really taken over, and Sonny's kind of over out of the light a little bit, and he's just kind of trying to find his groove, and it kind of goes along and it kind of builds to this kind of crescendo. And all the time the narrator's kind of watching this guy named Creole, who seems to be the leader of the band, and he's kind of talking about what he thinks about by watching him. Okay, so this one, you guys, most of you picked up on this one, and I think it's incredibly relevant. But if you read the whole thing, it's got a real rhythm to it, almost a movement, almost a kind of a physicality or a physical feel to it. So he says, for while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we triumph is never new, it always must be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness. Okay? So I would even think that goes back to that little clip we watched of Baldwin. So the last one I'm going to talk about is, this one's kind of obscure and kind of gets buried, but I really like it. So this is Sonny saying, I think people ought to do what they want to do. What else are they alive for? Well, I really think that's a good question. You know, why should I tolerate having other people impose their will on me? How does that even make you alive? So again, it kind of goes back to Chopin's idea. So there's a link to some other passages, but again, I think you guys did a really good job on the discussion boards on this, and I will also be just posting a text version of this for you to read, especially if you want to write your paper on this, then you can kind of use this as some ideas. All right, well, have a good weekend.